Thank you again for this opportunity. I hope my voice is clear. I think Syria is a great example of how many actors are involved, over 60 countries, when the Syrian people are not involved, when the agency that we're talking about does not have a seat on the table. And I mean, let me go back and create perhaps a different narrative than what was presented, is that the Arab Spring, as a wave of liberating the fake architecture of the region, shook the foundations of the regimes of Syria here specifically, but also others, and allowed for the people to regain power, to have a voice on of how to manage their own affairs. New civil society, local councils, governing councils were developed as a result of the vacuum of power, a result of the vacuum of administration, of the withdrawal of the failure of the state to respond appropriately to the demands of the people. Of course, the new technologies were definitely an enabler for the people. When a state sponsors and abets terrorist groups and commits gross human rights violations, it loses its legitimacy. There's a great question on the legitimacy of those states that commit those atrocities. And so when we talk about a regional partner, a legitimate regional partner, we always see a state sponsoring terrorism being on the table, and unfortunately forcing its agenda. And then we see that only two groups are labeled as terrorists: Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And then we forget about where many of the ISIS leadership were residing prior to the rise of ISIS, and what countries have they not attacked during their vicious cycle of those, I mean, namely Iran, basically. And so if Iran is the enemy of ISIS, why is it that on Syrian grounds, as a Syrian, I have not seen a battle going around between ISIS and Iranian-backed, 60-plus backed militias inside Syria? Those are the new actors forcing themselves on the ground. When they have failed to play politics, they resort to violence. When a state have failed to act in political roles with its people, it resorted to committing violent acts. It resorted to authorizing local militias. This is the state of Syria, the Assad regime, namely, basically losing control over its own people and over its own supporters. And now it's a regime that only lives in a state of war, and it cannot survive in a state of peace. It does not possess the tools necessary for creating peace. The 68 foreign militias, I mean, we talk about the big gorilla of the room. Foreign fighters are foreign fighters. When we talk about Iranian PKK members that are coming into Syria helping YPG, those are foreign fighters. Syrian Kurds have a right to govern their own affairs and to have a say into their own affairs. Turkmen have a say. Syrians, all Syrians, the majority of Syrians that have been marginalized throughout the 50 years of the rule of Assad and his family. There's a clear distinction here between the state and the regime. Syrians have not gone against the state institutions. Syrians want to preserve state institutions, and they want to end the hijacking of state institutions by specific minorities or individuals within a specific minority. The impact of these foreign non-state actors and the attempts by the Syrian regime and Iran to legalize them in the Astana talks, legalizing them as partners on the table, when those non-state actors that are foreign should be withdrawn out of the country. And then we talk about the non-state actors that are within the country, who are the ones that could become, could go through the DDR processes and become local police, become part of the army. I mean, there's talk about what groups, and even Russia now recognizes many of the moderate Syrian groups that are able to control and preserve security on the local level. I have to say there's an unspoken about actor on the ground in Syria called the local administration councils. And those are councils based on the legitimate voting and elections and consensus of the local populations. There are over 405, 406 local councils in areas outside of the control of the regime. Those councils are able to create local consensus, are able to provide public services, public utilities, public roads, public safety, sometimes with many difficulties and challenges, obviously, in terms of their relationships with the local armed groups. But nevertheless, it has succeeded in many spots around Syria that creates some sort of a hope in terms of how those local governing councils that are civil, basically, and they're non-military groups, of providing this kind of a new hope, a new consensus within local populations. I see that the Syria scene has failed, has failed in terms of the deconstruction of the social pact, and that there needs to be a new social agreement between Syrians on how they can govern their affairs, how can they become partners, all segments of Syrian society becoming partners in the new architecture. The polarization and sectarianization created by the Syrian regime and its backers is creating a major rift and instability. This is the source of stability. In fact, this is the source of stability that attracted ISIS to begin and to form its so-called state. This is the vacuum of governance, the vacuum of consensus that created the necessary atmosphere for terrorist groups to spur and grow. This is how the YPG or the PKK was created, also to create instabilities. It was first supported by the Assad regime, and then before 2011, when there was a rapprochement between Syria and Turkey, the Assad regime put most of them in jail, surprisingly, and the same thing belongs to Al-Qaeda fighters also, that were sent and sponsored by the Assad regime to go fight in Iraq and cause instability. All of a sudden, they're all in jail, and then all of a sudden in 2011, they let go of those people. Surprisingly, some of them end up fighting in the northeast and creating the so-called self-governing region, and others have ended up within ISIS groups. And so we really have to name things as they are and discuss them clearly of who are these people, the thousands, the more than 10,000 of fighters that were in the prisons of the Assad regime. Those are the true and the source of instability in the region. And I'm not dismissing the fact and the destabilization roles by the US and by other actors in the region, but I'm saying the core source of instability has been the way that the regime and its backers have dealt with the legitimate demands of the Syrian people. Today we have an opportunity. Today we have an opportunity for Syrians to be given the ability to negotiate their future and to have a say in their future, all Syrians of all walks of life, of forming a transitional governing body that represents all Syrians, that goes beyond the current regime and establishes a continuation of a state, a reform of state institutions. We at Omran Center have presented a file of 6 programs of reestablishing societal peace, of reestablishing societal security as one form of security that needs to be taken care of, and a new social pact that all elements within Syrian society should be put on the table, should be allowed a say on the table and on how they want to govern their affairs. A security agency that protects the people, not the regime. A security agency that does not get involved in people's affairs. And also we put a plan for the Syrian security reform, the SSR, from the bottom up and not from the top down. And this is where many of the talks, when you talk about Iran and Saudi Arabia and Turkey coming together, and forgetting the grassroots, forgetting the agency that's going to implement such talks. And those are the Syrians that have been kept outside of the table for a long time. I think it's important to talk about real issues in terms of how to reform security agencies in Syria, how they can consider the concerns and legitimate concerns of the actors of the region, but this needs to take place in the transitional period, in the post-Assad era, where at least the destabilization elements, the real core elements of destabilization in the entire region prior to the Arab Spring has been stemming from Damascus, unfortunately. Once we really fix this problem and we move to a new governing body, to a new system that includes all Syrians, that fights terrorism seriously, not in the way of the international community currently fighting ISIS without a of what's next question, this is when we begin to set the path towards true stabilization programs, true security of the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this.